So what's the workplace going to look like in 2023? We thought that remote work was pretty much here to stay. It is to a degree, but a lot of companies are bringing back their workers either on a part-time schedule in the office or full-time in some cases. Martine Haas is a professor of management at the Wharton School. She's also director of the Lauder Institute for Management and International Studies. Martine, great to talk to you again.
Good to see you, Dan.
So what level do you think remote work is going to be here in the future? Because I think that's a little bit of a moving target still.
Yeah, I think you're right. It really is a bit of a moving target still. We've seen, a lot of changes over the past year, but my sense is that hybrid is here to stay. I think that a lot of companies have moved towards hybrid in the last year and have found it, not perfect by any means, but kind of seems to be striking a pretty decent balance for, between what employees want and what employers want. Again, not perfect, and a lot of firms are still thinking through how to make it as good as can be. Pure remote, I think, is less likely to be really dominant in the future, but there will be some industries in which it really does make sense, some sectors, particularly tech, IT. But and maybe some kind of companies, smaller companies, startups, ones that want to attract employees who really can be anywhere, can work from anywhere, and the work allows for that. So I think remote will stay in some sectors, but fully remote I think is going to be less omnipresent than hybrid, which again seems to be the way that a lot of companies are going right now.
You bring up a good point, because it does feel like it's either business by business or sector by sector in many cases, how some of these decisions are being made. We have talked on this show about banking and how it seems like a lot of the big banks feel more comfortable of having their employees back in the office rather than having them remote.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's going to be a lot more variation, heterogeneity than there's been in the past. Investment banks, I think, on one end of kind of wanting everybody in, and a lot of them are really kind of bringing people in, most of the time these days. But they'll still, there's some niche banks, there's some more international banks that might keep with a more mixed kind of model. And then there's some industries and companies for which it's just going to be really, they're going to go much more remote. And I think, what we're seeing is that's also reflected in what employees want. I think there's just a lot of heterogeneity, right? Some people really want to be completely remote, but it's not everybody. Some people really want to be in person, right? And a lot of people kind of want that mix, or are willing to live with the mix if their companies want it. And so I think it's going to shake out it's looking like right now over the kind of middle, longer term as being, well, there's just going to be more variation than there used to be in this, and companies and people are going to figure out what's working for them.
Well, I think that's interesting because, realistically, you're talking about the personal needs of the employee playing a factor in the decision process moving forward, which, correct me if I'm wrong, if we go back 10, 15, 20 years, the personal needs of the employee really weren't considered a whole heck of a lot.
Right, even 5 years, right? So that's been the really big shift of the pandemic, is that, what employees want, I think, has really become much, much more important, and companies are going to have had to take a lot more notice of that. Of course, particularly because the job market, at least here in the US, has been very tight, right? So I think, that is likely to shift if the job market weakens and the sort of power shifts a little bit more towards the employers. They might have more ability to bring employees back. It's harder for employees to just jump ship if they're not comfortable with that. But I do think that that's been a really fundamental change, is that employers have realized and employees have realized that sort of mental health, well-being, work-life balance has become a much bigger deal. And so, my hope is that employers don't, if it does shift to their advantage a bit more, that they don't just take advantage of that and sort of ignore all the stuff they've learned about what employees really want. And similarly, I think employees need not to take advantage if they're in a more powerful position, which they have been over the past year or so, to push it to extremes that employers are really uncomfortable with, because that reduces the trust and creates all sorts of issues, sort of in terms of how employers feel about having employees at home at least some of the time. So I think you're looking at more of a balance going forward if everybody's going to get to a better place on this.
Well, and that brings up the question of productivity levels, which seemingly I would imagine is going to be more of a focus as we move forward. If you have employees that are working 3 days a week from home, 2 in their office, that question of productivity is going to be focused on more, especially when you're thinking about the review process or going for raises or going for, for corporate bumps.
Yeah, productivity is, something that people were kind of trying to measure and get a handle on all through the pandemic. I'm not sure that we can extrapolate much from what happened during the sort of intense pandemic months. In terms of productivity, people were working harder in some cases and didn't have the tech at home. In other cases, there's all sorts of stuff that's kind of going on. So I think companies are going to have to watch this closely going forward. And, productivity is one word. It's a very sort of limited word. There's also creativity and culture and all these other things that mentoring that go into making the workplace, right, that go beyond kind of short-term productivity. So that we're going to have to watch all of those very carefully, I think, over the coming year.
How do you think boards of directors have been impacted by this shift, these change of mindsets, and what they now expect from not only the company as a whole, but from their leaders when they have these dynamics at play?
Yeah, I think, boards of directors were taken by, storm or surprise, as was everybody else, and sort of trying to figure out what the heck does this mean, even for us meeting as a board of directors. I think one of the things that is occupying more time from boards of directors right now is, cybersecurity and all the issues that come up when people are working in a much more distributed way, right? When people are working from home, credit card information, healthcare information of their patients or customers, all sorts of private confidential information to the firm becomes much more important. So, some of the surveys are kind of saying, well, boards are becoming much more concerned about some things that they were concerned about before, but at much higher levels. And then, of course, they've got to think about, along with the corporate leadership, the CEOs, what is the company's work model got to look like over time, and that's, again, something that I think is varying a lot firm by firm, and everybody's going to have to think through at the board level as well as at the management level.
There's also been the discussion around, that relationship between employees and how their differing schedules may impact the work relationships. And I think it's being kind of, brought in as, making the hybrid workplace a fair and equitable standard for all employees across the board.
Right. Yeah, so from the employees level, and obviously their managers, right? There's a lot of challenges involved in being set up in a hybrid way. I think if people are really hybrid and coming into the office, 3 days a week or something into the workplace, and then at home 2 days a week, a lot of it kind of can get taken care of so long as you're thoughtful about what people are doing when they're in the office versus at home. It's when people are really remote, all of the time, and then particularly when you have other people who are in person all of the time, that some of these issues around fairness become particularly acute. So in some ways, again, I think hybrid sort of solves, or at least is a livable way of managing a number of problems that are I think we can deal with. Okay, I mean, one big thing I think as we look to the future, the next year in particular, is companies were kind of forced into the whole situation of being completely remote, and then into kind of trying to get people back and moving towards these sort of new models. And as a result, we've been all kind of doing our best, right? And some things are generally okay and seem to be working. But I think that 2023 will be a year when it makes sense for companies to really maybe take a step back and think a little bit more systematically. Okay, now we've got people in most of the time. It's kind of going okay, but let's make sure we're actually sort of systematically reviewing our policies and procedures, right? And how are things working around our HR, our hiring practice, our technology, our space needs. It's almost like you want to set up working groups for your company for each of these different kind of critical areas: employee engagement, satisfaction, security, productivity, wellness, all the things we've talked about, right? To really kind of think, okay, are we doing it as well as we can? Now we're doing it, at least we know we can kind of do this and we think it's working. But don't just settle for the way you started doing it in month one of everybody coming back to the office. Try to think about, okay, how do we sort of set it up for success and really to be as good as it can be going forward?
Two quick things to ask you about, just in the dynamics of what we've seen play out. One being the turnover rate, amongst employees. It's obviously been very high. Obviously, part of that is being driven by the higher rate of pay that a lot of people are getting when they go to that next job. Does that turnover rate continue, or do you think that settles down at some point?
Look, I think it's very driven by the economy, and unemployment rates, still in the US are really very low. So depending on what happens in terms of the job market. But, if you're in a situation where people are feeling dissatisfied or sort of realizing that they need to change, which is kind of what was happening in the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, and there are opportunities to go somewhere that looks better, and and the job market is really advantageous, then you're going to see a lot of movement like we've been seeing in recent months. I think probably some of that does start to settle down a little bit now as people find their kind of match to companies that look kind of the way that they want them to. And as sort of, sectors and industries and maybe geographies start to settle on a dominant kind of model where most of the firms in this area are kind of doing similar kinds of things. But again, a lot of it is going to just be driven by the job market. And when there's a lot of opportunity to move, you're going to see people moving to their more perfect job and their better paid job, at a higher rate.
And finally, I wanted to ask you about how you think hybrid will impact that process that employees go through of trying to progress their career, of networking, of all of these normal processes to continue to build towards a C-suite position or a manager's level position, right. And how that is impacted, you think?
I think that in a hybrid world, it kind of employees need to be really on top of their game, thinking about it actively, right? So they need to be thinking about, if I'm not there all the time in the office, when I am there, what am I doing to connect with people? How am I meeting with people? Forging kind of new relationships and so on. And I've only got 3 days a week to do that rather than 5 days a week to do that. And particularly, if I'm completely out of the office, completely remote, then you need to really think about kind of active ways to make those connections that we know are going to kind of help, create new opportunities and give you new leads and introduce you to new people and so on. But it's not only employees who need to think about this, right? The employers and the managers in firms really have a responsibility, and that's part of what they need to be thinking about in managing the hybrid workforce, to help their folks make those kinds of connections and create opportunities. And of course, there's lots of creative ways you can do that, which are probably not what have been happening at firms, until now.